I run an institution called Deer Art Foundation. And at Deer, we have for many decades now stewarded a number of land art works, American West, works that have enabled us and also forced us to really think about what it means to steward these works and what it means to think about the place of these works in the current condition, works in the American West, in Utah, and in New Mexico. So this really was the sort of starting point for the inspiration. But from my perspective, of course, as somebody who works in the culture industry, I was also very interested in thinking about our own institution, the institutions that hold art, and the ways in which perhaps we need to address our own behavior, our own culture, and the resources we can. So among the questions that I think we'll be looking at over the next couple of days are institutional responsibility. What can we do better? Land preservation and ownership, and the long-term sustainable approaches that I hope that we can begin to discuss and think about collectively over these coming days. So this is an image of the lightning field, one of the works that we own and run out in New Mexico, an incredible work by Walter de Maria in New Mexico. And I think a great example, too, of the way in which these varying artists who worked in the 1970s beginning to explore the landscape and think about the land as an opportunity for making art, bringing people to these landscapes. Also, a sort of varying degree in which they touch the landscape. This, of course, it's a monumental piece. It's 1 mile by 1 kilometer. It's a sort of phenomenal scale. But at the same time, it's a very static work. It's required one conservation sort of attention in its 40-year lifespan. And in fact lives sort of very harmoniously in the landscape. And not only that, it's also caused us to protect and acquire land around it in order to preserve that landscape. So now there's a sort of vast territory around this work, which sort of encompasses this extraordinary landscape, which is, of course, now protected in eternity, we hope, ideally. Other works that are also run by Deer include Nancy Holt's Sun Tunnels, a work in Utah. A very different type of work in terms of its construction. One of the interesting conversations we were having earlier was sort of how were these works made? Now, De Maria's Lightning Field was produced with Deer's patronage in the 1970s. Of course, you can imagine quite a large amount of resources went into its making. Nancy Holt, meanwhile, a female artist, I think a very important part of this equation, made this work herself. She funded it herself, she built it herself. In the Utah basin. And similarly to the lightning field, it's actually a work that has existed now out in the desert in this sort of incredibly changeable climates, of course, very high temperatures in the summer, very low in the winter. It's managed to survive almost untouched now for again, many decades. Spiral Jetty, another work of land art, which raises, of course, very interesting questions about its conservation, its survival. It's a piece that is produced by an artist who was interested in the notion of entropy, of sort of collapse, of destruction even. So do we ever change this work? Does it gradually disintegrate on its own? It's sitting in the basin of the Salt Lake adjacent to the Salt Flats. And all, of course, are well worth a visit. James Turrell's Roden Crater, a work that many of you might have heard of, but probably very few of you have visited. It's yet to be open, many decades later. And I wanted to point to, I suppose, Roden Crater and other land art works that have taken a very different approach, sort of huge resources in order to produce them and maintain them, very different types of approach to making work in the landscape. All of these artists, I would say, were deeply influenced by the work of artists, we could say, cultures, civilizations, many centuries before them. And in fact, you see very direct correspondences, say, between the Nazca lines that you see here and an artist, or indeed this extraordinary work, the Ziggurat of Ur, and the work of someone like Michael Heiser in the Nevada desert. Clearly, these artists were not only wanting to make the same impact as indeed culture has for so many centuries, wanted to impact the land, to touch the land, to sort of change the land, but also to compete almost with this kind of history of civilization and its impact on the landscape. Questions, I think, that are very pertinent to now, of course. Would we condone such behavior now? What do we think about it as a sort of contemporary practice, producing kind of monuments in the desert that require dozens of heavy lifting equipment. Is that the way that we see land art of the future, or indeed culture of the future? But I think it raises the same questions around engineering, structures, architecture, the way in which we address the landscape on many platforms in this sort of broader understanding of what culture in the landscape and the use of resources can be, the subject really of our discussion over the next couple of days. Not only the question of resources, of course. Good, I'm glad somebody's brave to sit in front. But many of these works, of course, are on indigenous territories. So the ownership of the land is now something that we question a great deal more than we'd had previously. Institutions, responsibilities. We have institutions that sort of on the exterior espouse a sort of very impassioned connection with the environment, and then internally perhaps affecting the environment in a negative way in their own construction and production. We've got ambitious projects that are working with a different type of language, a different type of references to indigenous architecture. The work of Renzo Piano, quoting the local New Caledonian language, but I think perhaps far more interesting, the work of architects such as Mariam Kamara, working in Niger with his extraordinary marketplace, or indeed Marina Tabassum in Bangladesh, again, producing new vernaculars with local materials, with a completely different approach to architectural impact. Our speakers for the next couple of days, I'll just very quickly run through those for today. I'll be speaking with Jonas in a moment. As Anneliek mentioned, I mean, we're incredibly happy to have Joan with us. She's had so many exhibitions, I think I won't even mention very many of them, apart from to say that Andrea Lasoni, who actually worked on 2 of her major exhibitions in the last few years, is with us, which is wonderful. Andrea worked on both her major retrospective at Tate Modern and at Hangar Bikoka, so we're very happy to have both of you here with us. El Último Grito, these fantastic chairs that you're sitting on with the amazing backs, which are actually produced from recycled awnings from cafes, have been produced by the students at HEAD, where Rosario, who's one half of El Último Grito, and will be speaking in a moment, she worked with the students with us to produce this kind of creative seating arrangement so that we could get away from these kind of straight lines and rather dull logical thinking. I'm hoping that this is more of a speculative ground where we can think in a different way, and hopefully sitting in a different way will also help that. We have Djamila Ribeiro here with us from Brazil, who is going to bring a perspective, I hope, from both a feminist and also Afro-Brazilian perspective on the issues that we're questioning today. Philippe Rahm, who's here, an architect who's worked for many decades now and thinking through the complications of ecology and architecture. Dominique Gonzalez-Forster, sadly, as Anneliek mentioned, is not able to be with us today, but will be presenting her work through film. Oh. And that was Philippe. And we're going to move on. So Joan, maybe I can invite you up to sit with me.